Hello, my name is Noah Ravoy, and I'm here today with James Fox Higgins, and we're talking about agency, and specifically how agency pertains to young men, why they need to work on their agency, and what challenges young men are facing in the development of agency. Welcome, James.
Thanks for having me, Noah. It's great to be here.
Excellent. I'm really happy to have you here. We always have very interesting discussions. I think a good place to start is to describe what agency is. So it's the ability for human beings to direct their own lives using rational reason, logic, and evidence, as opposed to being programmed by their instincts, their animal instincts, you might say, or controlled by other people. Agency right now is truly lacking, especially in a lot of young people, a lot of young men who need agency because they have great ideas of how they'd like to change the world, but they're lacking the tools to do that. And I think this is partly why some people like, for example, Jordan Peterson became very popular, very quickly, is that he appealed to young men's desire to have agency and to get control over their lives. And unfortunately, when they actually went to him, they found that it was a lot of self-flagellating and clean your room, and you're not good enough to change the world yet. You need to do this massive, unfinishable list of things. And a lot of these young men, they got stuck in this spiral where they're not actually accomplishing anything. They're just focused on self-improvement for the sake of self-improvement. And I wrote a course to help young men, including a lot of the men that have been through this, to learn how to reprogram themselves and to remove some of these negative programming loops that they have and be able to get agency so that they can get or can accomplish the things they want to accomplish in life.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to doing your course actually, because there's always more steps to take. I certainly have developed my agency a lot more in the last few years than I had, for the decades prior. But there's still, I can see where my own weaknesses are. And I liken the idea of agency to there's a spectrum, and on one end there's NPCs, that meme, that people understand quickly because it's those people who are just vessels for the programming of the world around them. They just do what they're commanded to do. They think what they're told to think. They just take whatever's given, and they don't seem to act of their own free will or their own volition in any way. There's a lot of people who are close to that extreme of the spectrum. And there are some people who are, living it fully. And then the other extreme are like your demigod type people who are so high in agency that they change the world. They're the conquerors and the paradigm shifters and, the people who go out and create empires. There are very few people who are fully embracing of their agency as an individual at that end of the spectrum. And most of us are somewhere in between and hopefully on a journey, towards higher agency, if we don't want to just be a slave.
Mm-hmm. And that's really what it is. It's about having actual freedom. And when we think about slavery, we usually think of one person being a slave to someone else. But we can be a slave to addictions. We can be a slave to our own impulses. We have a lack of control of our impulses. We can be a slave to procrastination and laziness as well. And unfortunately, we get a lot of this kind of advice. There's a lot of agents that want us to have low agency, and we get advice such as just do whatever you feel like. That's agency sapping advice.
And it's not always explicit like messaging in that way. It's a subtle, sneaky feed of that information, and it shows up in our social media experience every day, in the advertising that comes up on the side, in the ready availability of pornography. A click away, you can have any fantasy you want. In gaming, the gaming world, a click away, you can have any kind of virtual experience of life that you want. And it just goes on and on, not to mention food and, the kind of hedonistic pleasures that we can seek cheaply, the addictive, sugary foods that are available. All of these things are pervasive around us. And so many people aren't even conscious that as you walk through a supermarket, you're just being bombarded with subtle messaging of eat me, give in, follow the impulse, don't think about the future, don't have a long time horizon, just do what feels good now, it'll only cost you $1.05.
And you know, our ancestors, they often had to display, their choices were display agency or die. This is especially true if, you know, I come from Canada originally, and you're in Australia, and those were countries that were settled in relatively recent times, last few hundred years. If you're a settler, there's no pre-existing community there for you to sponge off of if you don't have agency. When you go out there, you have to be the tip of the spear. You have to be the one that goes to the untouched land and says, I'm going to put a house here and a farm, and I'm going to feed my family. And I'm going to do that no matter how much suffering, because my alternative to that is die of starvation. Nowadays, your alternative to showing agency is not showing agency. You actually have an alternative. You can just be lazy. You can get welfare. You can sponge off your parents. A lot of young people doing that. You can basically be a parasite in society, and you can get off pretty well. You know, we see this movement sweeping certain corners of right-wing thought of, you know, $1,000 a month is worth a vote. You know,
gang.
This is an attempt to put off the necessity to show agency. And the worse things get in society, the more important it will be for us to return to showing agency. Now, a lot of people say, how is it possible that the incredibly well-developed and powerful Western culture, and I'm not talking technologically, but the culture of how we managed our sexual markets, how we managed our in-group preference, how we managed law, and all of these things has decayed so much in 100 years. And people blame, you know, they'll blame postmodernist, Marxist, Jews, French Enlightenment thinkers and all this stuff. That is not why it happened. It happened because the majority of white Western men decided that they were comfortable enough they didn't need to demonstrate agency. And as more and more men stopped demonstrating agency, they allowed other people to fill that vacuum and basically to enslave them. You know, the Americans' ancestors a couple hundred years ago, they had a civil war, or they had a revolution over like 3% tax on tea. You know, these were men that said no more. Now, it did take them about 30 years between when people first started talking about a revolution until it actually happened. And they weren't quick for it because they knew that it was going to be a horrible, horrible thing. It was not going to be pleasant at all. And
many of them were going to die. You know, that when you take on a challenge that big, there's, you know, you have to take it on with the willingness to see it through to death for something bigger than yourself. That takes a lot of agency.
Exactly. In fact, if you're not committed to what you believe in to the point you're willing to die for it, you don't really believe in it.
Yeah.
And the groups that are that committed are very successful. You know, if you have two groups that are committed to die, then it comes down to their individual ability. But a group that is significantly inferior can win a conflict simply by being willing to kill and die for it. And
we can see demographically how this is playing out in the West at the moment, is that, you know, there is a group who are much more willing to kill and die for their beliefs than we are. And you know, we're slowly being replaced by them.
Yeah, they have less technology. They have, in our countries, they have less numbers. They're still replacing us. They have less numbers for now.
I mean, their conviction is impressive at the least, you know.
And what's interesting is that they're not even a particularly high agency people, but the members of their community that have agency are so respected that they will follow those members' advice and instructions without really thinking. And they do value agency, even if they often are incapable of displaying it themselves.
Yeah, it's not equally distributed, but they respect the hierarchy of agency.
Yes, and there are methods of programming people so that they can function quite well, even at a low level of agency. You know, we are limited in our ability to demonstrate agency by physical factors. So we have a limit to how powerful our brain is. We have a limit to how healthy and strong we are, how much energy we have to go out and work at our goals. But if we are correctly programmed, so if we are programmed in a way that is conductive to achieving our goals, we're able to amplify our natural abilities quite a bit. And what I do is I teach people to reprogram themselves so that they get rid of the self-limiting behaviors that they have, the ones that are programmed in by society, and they're able to fully unleash their abilities. If you're teaching someone, for example, to powerlift, with powerlifting, the difference between a world record and, yeah, there's 50 guys that can lift that much, is not physical, it's psychological.
Yeah.
They will prepare you psychologically to lift a lot of weight. I'm by no means close to any kind of world record, but when I was lifting about 3 times my body weight, when I would do that, it was more psychological. That last 20% of the weight, 10% of the weight was psychological than physical. I had to program myself to believe that I could do it. And I had to approach it in a deeply meditative way. When we do these type of things, so whether it's weightlifting or another sport or one of the kind of exercises that's in the course that I offer, it causes us to think in a certain way where we develop mindfulness. And that mindfulness is the key to developing agency, because it means that we are taking control over our mind and our thoughts.
Now, I guess it has to be a particular kind of mindfulness too, because I want to tie back to what you were saying earlier about Christianity, that where, you know, Christian prayer and a lot of Christian meditation has elements of mindfulness in it. It can also, like Peterson has created with his work, it can create these vicious cycles of low agency. I saw a great Babylon Bee article today that was saying a Christian man gets caught in a vicious cycle of thinking he's humble enough, and it's that, oh yes, I'm finally humble. Oh damn, yes, I'm finally humble. Oh damn, you know, like if you're constantly chasing your tail, aiming at some kind of, you know, moral perfection, that can actually hinder the action that's required to display and demonstrate agency. And mindfulness can become a trap if it's not used properly, right? So it has to be applied properly to develop agency.
Absolutely. A lot of what, you know, I'm writing in the middle of writing a post about virtue, and a lot of what virtue is habits. So it's habits that we need to display over time. And we, you know, if we have the habit of being truthful, then we are honest, that we have the virtue of honesty. That doesn't mean that we've never lied in our life, because we're imperfect, we're humans, we make mistakes, we lie, we give in to temptation to do things. It's what is habitual. You know, people can pretty much guarantee that every time we say something, it's going to be true. Well, then we have the virtue of honesty. And we don't need to worry about the perfection. We need to worry about developing the habit. And we need to have mental tools in order to properly evaluate what we're doing and look at it rationally. A lot of times when so-called virtues, such as mindfulness, when virtues like developing mindfulness go off the rails, is when 2 things happen. One, we allow someone else to control our mindfulness. So if someone else is leading our meditation, they're in control of us. When we put ourselves into a meditative mindset, we are very susceptible to suggestion. It's nearly brainwashing. Now, this can be very useful. It can be a great way to quickly internalize positive ideas. But we have to be really, really, really careful, because we can internalize unhealthy ideas as well. And we need tools to be able to rationally look at the ideas we have internalized and ideas we're thinking about internalizing, and to say, no, there's something wrong here. This isn't correct. And to be able to identify it. Why is this irrational? What is the long-term outcome of this going to be? This is why, as I mentioned, we're somewhat limited physically in our ability to demonstrate agency, because we have different levels of intelligence. Now, on the other hand, you've probably met smart people that do stupid things.
I've been one of them many times.
You know, and you know, I'm a smart guy. I've done stupid things too. Sometimes I've had stupid patterns of behavior that have repeated. And, you know, part of the reason why I'm able to create a course like this is because I fixed my own life by applying these principles. And by discovering them and by gathering them together and making notes for myself, and now for my clients, and finally for the general public. And when we get into those habits, into those negative cycles, it's really hard to get out. And this is why, you can have a high IQ culture that is fairly incapable of running things because they have a lack of agency. So, for example, the Japanese people, have a slightly higher IQ than Europeans. And yet Europeans have about 98% of the world's inventions. They've created 98% of the world's inventions. The reason is because Japanese, not that they're low agency, but their agency is directed in a different way, primarily towards conforming. Their internal program is primarily about conforming to the group. So during the 400 years that Japan was cut off from the rest of the world, when they were isolated, they had zero technological progress during that time. They were exactly the same from beginning to end. And I'm sure if it was possible for them to be cut off forever, they would still be at that same level. And it creates a very stable society, but it also creates a society incapable of growth.
When you've got tradition and honor and saving face as the priorities over, innovation and truth. And speaking the truth, even when it actually is disagreeable and causes people embarrassment, then it's hard to break out of that cycle, isn't it?
Yeah, and Japan has been able to invent some things, especially in the last 100 years, because they have adopted other ideas from other cultures, mostly from European culture, about the value of individual thought. Now, they haven't adopted to the level we have, but they started to pick a little bit of that up, especially when it comes to a specific area. It is interesting, too, that you'll see people who have wonderful levels of agency in their work, and they're very financially successful. You can see, for example, Steve Jobs, wonderfully financially successful, built an amazing company, very high agency, a terrible father. Because in his personal life, and pretty much terrible with romantic relationships too, in his personal life, he didn't demonstrate agency. There was something in his sub-programming that he didn't address that made it very difficult for him to excel in personal relationships. There's nobody you go, oh yeah, that guy was a friend of Steve Jobs. No, he had people he worked with. He didn't really have friends. And we can see people, really smart people today, not being successful or only being successful in some areas because they've got some underlying programming that they need to address. That means in those areas.
Do you think there's like a sort of a finite fuel of agency that you have that you need to distribute across your different areas of life, and and that may be at the cost of that great success in business, but it means that you have more stable relationships and more agency in other areas? Do you think there's sort of like a cap on our agency we've got to spread out?
Yes, absolutely. Agency requires a lot of deep thinking. So you have to actually think about it. Is what I'm doing, is what I'm about to do, consistent with rationality, logic, and reason, and with my plans, and with my ethical and moral framework? You have to think about it. And thinking takes time and energy. So if we're focused on work, we're going to spend a lot more time thinking about that. And we're going to have less time to think about our family. And I think the happiest people are the ones that have a balance of that. So there's a lot of envy of the very wealthy. The fact is most of those people are unhappy. They're profoundly unhappy. Their children hate them. Their marriages are unstable, and sometimes they're married multiple times. And nobody really loves them because they can't develop a normal relationship. They have all this money in the way. And I do not envy the very wealthy. Of course, we'd all like to have more money, but it's because it gives us more power. More money allows us to display our agency in higher ways. But there is a point of diminishing returns.
I've noticed with a lot of people that I've encountered in life and some people that I've worked with, who are having relationship difficulties, family life difficulties, parenting difficulties, that low agency that you're describing, it often manifests as knee-jerk emotional reactions to things as a way of trying to instantly deal with them or put them away or push them aside. And this, this has been true of myself in my worst moments as a husband and father as well, where you have a strong emotional knee-jerk reaction to things instead of taking a moment to calmly and rationally work through them. And it's sort of a way of just, pushing the problem out with a high intense energy burst, rather than choosing to use that slow burn of the agency that you have to solve problems and work things through.
And see, the fact that you notice that you're conscious of that, that's why the mindfulness, the conscientiousness, mindfulness develops conscientiousness. That's why that's important, is for you to be aware of what you're doing and take a look at it. Not just to program you to think a certain way. So you're aware of that. The moment you become aware of a bad habit, truly aware of it and aware of its effects, you can start to change it. Until you're aware of it, you can't. And something that I wanted to mention too, and talk about is, it's a lot about conscience. So we talk about conscientiousness and the conscience. So in the story of Pinocchio, funny we mentioned Jordan Peterson and Pinocchio in the same video, but in the story of Pinocchio, his father is Geppetto and his mother is the fairy that comes down, so to speak, because they each contribute to his creation. And he gets, he is created without a conscience. He has no conscience. He doesn't know right from wrong. And he is given a conscience that is quite defective and doesn't work very well, is the little cricket. And that's what happens when we're kids. When we're born, we don't really have much of a conscience. All we're aware of at first is that we need to eat, and we've soiled ourselves, and we need a hug, and we need love. And as we grow up, our parents should be training us how to have agency, how to have consciousness about what we're doing. And unfortunately, if parents don't have agency, they're incapable of teaching their children to have agency. You can't teach a child agency when you don't possess it yourself. Not only do you set, of course, a bad example, but you can't understand agency and not have it. And so if you're a parent, you need to suddenly develop a higher level of agency. This, becoming a parent, I'm sure changed you. It definitely changed me.
Radically, yeah.
It makes us think not just about what we're doing, but why we're doing what we're doing. And that's, part of the mindfulness and the conscientiousness.
So a big thing was time horizons opening up for me, and having children. It's like you can afford as an individual man, or even as a young couple, you can afford to live in the moment and, be a bit hedonistic and spend your money on a good time instead of, making those long-term plans and investments and savings. And then having children, it's like, well, so much has to go on hold just to make sure that this kid doesn't starve or, choke to death in the night or whatever. Like all of the things you have to do to keep this little being who's completely dependent on you alive naturally opens up your time horizons to go, well, if we have to suspend our normal life for this period of growth for this child, which is, going to be about 18 years, what do we sacrifice now so that in the future, we can all eat, we can all be okay. And so you naturally have to start thinking in broader time horizons. Unfortunately, in the West at the moment, we also then have the unnatural support of the welfare system and all of these, these social pressures in the other direction to go, no, you don't need to worry about that. We've got universal daycare, universal healthcare. The government will do everything that you can't do. So rather than parents naturally waking up as we ought to when we have children and having their time horizons expand and to begin to develop their agency just as a natural product of having a child to care for, unfortunately that's being hindered by the social welfare system that we have, which is saying we'll do it for you, the government will do it for you.
Yeah, and have you ever met someone that, I'm in Canada, we used to have an incredibly generous welfare state. They did cut it back about 15, 20 years ago, quite a bit. But before that, it was so generous that we had 4-generation welfare families. They've been 4 generations, no one had had a job. it had done so much damage to them at a cultural level that you had parents that never really grew up. They progressed until the point of about 16 emotionally and mentally, and then they were having children, and those children never progressed very far. And you had people that were truly and completely useless. When the welfare state was reduced, it took a while. Those people, because they had to, they started to demonstrate more agency, but a lot of the damage is done. The culture is erased. If you have to go to work, if you have a schedule, if you have obligations and commitments, you have to think about how you're going to organize yourself. You have to think, if I got to be at work at 9 o'clock and it's a half-hour drive and it takes me an hour to get ready, and you start working your way back. You start thinking. Right now, we avoid thinking whenever we can as a society. We can't be seconds without a screen in front of us telling us what to think.
Yeah, and doing this like, oh, I'm bored, so start scrolling. And so I want to take this back to what you said earlier about the settlers in Australia and in Canada had to have high agency because it was life and death. And this is sort of, that's in a way the privilege of living in dangerous times, is that you don't have the choice and the illusion of comfort and safety around you. And I've found that, especially since having children, I've got more skin in the game. But in recent years, as the political landscape has been shifting, as things have been, moving in a fairly dire direction in the West, as my rational fear of the future increases, so has my agency. And so I've actually been, having some amazing breakthroughs in my agency over the last 12 months. One particularly surrounding my physical fitness and my ability to, enjoy the pain of exercise and pushing through and getting stronger. Used to be, it was something I shied away from for 32 years of my life because there was no necessity to it. But now that I have a rational fear of actually, maybe one day I'm going to have to run fucking fast with my kids on my back. And I want to actually be up to that job if that ever comes my way. Never entertained the thought that that would ever be possible until, things start to shift politically. And because I'm aware of what's going on in the world, the rational fear of what may happen forces me to develop and practice high agency.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, one of the ways we can develop agency is to put ourselves in some sort of a risk. You will probably notice, if you have a chance to talk to tradesmen, actual tradesmen, not just the laborers, but the skilled tradesmen that work with dangerous tools, and that, if they're, the more dangerous their trade, the more you'll notice this. These are generally people of average intelligence, but very high in agency. And if they're not high in agency, they end up dying in an accident pretty quickly because they don't pay attention to safety procedures. They're not taking care and concern when they're working. They don't take care of their tools. They end up dying. And, I remember Stefan Molyneux saying that he noticed that people that had physical jobs tended to be a lot more rational than people that had purely intellectual jobs. He was noticing that level of rationality. That comes from their agency. When you're dealing with the real world, you have to be rational. You have to have agency, or there will be consequences. Right now, a lot of us who have that insulation from the real world, that's quickly eroding. As our cultures become more diverse, they also become more dangerous. And as they become more dangerous, those who do not have agency or who do not belong to a group that has good tools to deal with lack of agency are going to suffer. And and those who have agency will benefit from it. They will profit from this change, because there's going to be a shift. At a certain point, the net is going to be pulled out, and we're going to be doing this live over a floor, so to speak. So it's going to become dangerous again. Just like the settlers had danger, forcing them to act with agency. There were people that went out to the West. There were people that went out to Australia and didn't have agency and weren't careful, and they died.
And there's a lot of people, if you go back through the generations, who have no progeny, who faced gene death and no longer exist, you know? And that's something that's important to remember, which is that each of us only exists because we have this long line of ancestors who made good decisions and had high enough agency to survive the very high likelihood of death and gene death that comes with it if you don't have children. And so we're gifted with this life and this existence because of the agency of our forebears. And so even though the world around us is encouraging us to have low agency and to just give in to the impulses and to, you know, to just scroll our life away and spend our life away on a good time, we're actually squandering a great gift that was given to us by countless generations before of agency.
Yeah. And it's about 50% of men throughout history never had children. So we do have, you know, people will talk about incels today and say, oh, this is some sort of a 21st century phenomena. There were always men who, for one reason or another, didn't have children, never reproduced, were unsuccessful in that. And to a large extent, this had to do with agency in the past. Today, there's other influences and other things as well. But we have a choice. We can choose to be men of agency. We can choose to develop our ability to make decisions, our power and control over our lives. Or we can choose to be a slave to something. That can be a slave to our own nihilism, our own negativity, our inability to have self-control, so our animal instincts, basically. We can be a slave to propaganda that other people give us. Or we can be free. We can choose. And it's the choice that I'm trying to put before people. You know, a lot of people, they will read self-help books. They will read, you know, Stoic philosophy is very good for reading to help you develop your agency. And they'll read it and they'll say, how do I apply this? I've had clients tell me, I don't care enough about my future to apply the good advice that I'm getting. And this was a big part of why I wrote this course, is I realized that for many people, a lack of agency is a lack of concern about their future. They don't truly have enough love for themselves to realize that they need to take action in order to have a happy and healthy future. They have low empathy for their future selves. And
or they have an inflated sense of security.
Yes.
You know, they believe that it'll just be fine.
Well, and some people, they, you know, I know people, for example, that are overweight. And now none of my clients are like this, but I know people who are overweight, know they're going to die young and don't care because they don't love themselves. You know, their parents didn't love them, so they were never modeled love. Their parents didn't help them to develop a healthy level of ego. So a healthy ego is based on, I'm a good person and I know that I'm a good person for these reasons, and I know that I have value for these logical and rational reasons. An unhealthy ego is someone tells you that you're important a million times and so you think it, but you don't have a healthy and stable foundation for that. A lot of young women go through this. They're told because they're beautiful, they have value. Then when these women start to hit the wall and their beauty fades, since that's the thing that gave them value in their mind, it completely crushes their ego and they go into deep depression. And this happens to a lot of people, that they have this dichotomy between, they've been told all their life that they're special, but they've never had it explained to them how to have a healthy ego, how to really know that you're a good person and that you have value for the future. And so they just don't really care that much about their future. They have a low level of empathy for their future self because they don't care about themselves.
Yeah. Now, I think agency is probably also the most important tool that men have in the sexual market. You talked about, you know, the fact that 50% of men throughout history have missed out on having children, and they're not the high agency blokes. You know, it's the guys of high agency that women are attracted to. And, you know, go back far enough into history and you'll find that the men of the highest agency, the 1%ers, they had 5 or 6 women get knocked up by them. You know, Hercules, he would have had a whole bunch of nymphs, you know, impregnated with his progeny.
Genghis Khan.
Genghis Khan. Yeah.
It wasn't just him. You see, people will say, well, he's the ancestor of like a third of people in Asia. but he was smart. He made sure that all of his sons had good positions and were well trained, and that all of them had many children. It's not enough just to have kids ourselves. We got to make sure that our children are strong so that they create families of their own.
That's right. And women are sexually turned on by high agency. And this is a thing that a lot of couples, when they're experiencing difficulty in intimacy and in the bedroom and in how to make the woman aroused enough, to want to have sex on a regular basis with her husband, the more that man develops his agency, guaranteed will increase her libido, because women can't resist men of high agency.
Yeah. Why do women, for example, like men who are why do they find physical fitness attractive in men? The reason that they find a strong man attractive is because it requires agency to develop your body. You need to have control over your eating. You need to force yourself to go out and exercise even when you don't feel like it. And yes, it is somewhat an indication of good genes, but mostly it's an indication of agency. The same reason why they want wealth. Wealth is not just wealth in of itself. There's a reason why even wealth that's beyond what's necessary to raise her children can be attractive, is because it shows that you have agency in order to manage yourself in such a way that you can have wealth. It's the same reason, too, why they will shit test you. What women are shit testing you for is to make sure you have agency. I'm going to throw the most illogical, irrational crap in your direction, and let's see if you can handle it. And what it is they want to see if you're sufficiently rational not to get caught up in their irrationality. And what they want to see is that you're a solid rock. You're a solid rock, then they can anchor on that rock.
And there's a lot of men, I guess, particularly in long marriages, who get confused and think that, when they say yes, dear, and they become compliant to those irrational demands of their wife, that it seems like they're getting a positive response. Let her win, let her have her way, and she'll be happy. But that's usually the beginning of a long and slippery deterioration of the relationship, because, like you say, she's shit testing. Even if she doesn't know it, instinctively she wants to test the boundaries of her man. And this is something that I thought Jordan Peterson enunciated really well, was that, marriage is when you shackle yourself to somebody else, and then you have a partner that you have to contend with. Marriage is not just about like, okay, we signed the agreement and now we get along and we just say yes to each other no matter what. And that's especially toxic if it's only one way, where one person is calling all the shots. But yeah, when one partner is going off the rails, the other partner needs to be the one to say, this is bullshit, pull it in. And particularly when a woman is being irrational, which they tend to be a lot more than men, not always, but that's the general tendency in the gender. It's, the best thing for the relationship and for the woman to feel secure is for the man to say, sweetheart, cut it out.
And one of the best ways as a man to avoid your wife giving you shit tests is to be high agency in areas where she can observe you being high agency, so that she doesn't feel the need to shit test you, just to make sure your agency is still intact.
One of those is having other male friends.
Having male friends. Let her see how you deal with those men. Let her see how you deal. You don't have to bring your work. You shouldn't be bringing your work problems home. But she sees you successful. When you get recognition and honors from your community, from your society and whatnot, your wife says, yeah, this guy, he's got something. There's something about him. And he's got it. He's on point, and I don't need to challenge him. If you're taking the lead in your community and you're the man demonstrating more agency in your community, that's how you take the lead. People say, what is leadership? Leadership means you're the highest agency man in the group. You will immediately get put in the position of leadership. And if you talk to high agency men, they will constantly say, yeah, I always end up in the leadership position even if I don't want it. And it's just because people will go, he's got the best agency, we should put him in deciding, in charge of deciding what happens or taking the lead.
And this is where we get to those terms alpha beta and gamma males, that a lot of people don't really understand how that works, or how do you get to be one, or you're just born one. But it's a product of agency. The highest agency men are the alphas. And it's okay to not be the alpha of every group, but you've got to be the alpha of some domain. Every man should strive to be the alpha of whatever domain he can be the alpha of, even if it's just like, a group of 3 friends, be the alpha there, even if you're not the top dog at work or the top dog in your society. Find a domain in which you can excel and lead, and develop your agency there, and then also have the humility to know your place in the other hierarchies.
If you're not excelling at work, and you're, for one reason or another, it's not your domain of highest competence, go out, start a small sports team, start join a pickup basketball league, recruit a couple of other men and start leading them. Start a hobby and get other people involved in it, and take leadership in that. Go out and do something that improves your community and organize a group of people. Even as a husband and a father, the way you take the lead with your children and with your wife is going to show her that you are within the family, at least you should be an alpha. You may not be an alpha around a bunch of other alpha men. In fact, I always find myself, if I'm at the top of the room, I want to go to the next room up, and I'm always seeking to find that next room where I'm not the highest agency man in the room. I would like to find a place where I can learn from other men of higher agency. And this is...
but that's part of the process of developing your agency, isn't it? Is to be seeking mentors who are of higher agency. And hopefully, it's a curse for those few men in history who are the absolute top of the top. But they serve their function, and they're usually remembered for many centuries. And the rest of us are looking for a cascade of mentors up to that point.
They carry a heavy burden. In studies of animals, they say that for example, in chimps, the alpha chimp has a very high cortisol level. He doesn't tend to live very long because he's got the stress and responsibility of demonstrating agency for himself and protecting the entire group. That's why it's not such a bad thing to be a beta if you're in support of the alpha. And you don't have to be that far down. You might only be slightly down from him, but stress, big stress. This is why I'm trying to always look for the room. I'm not the highest man of agency, and if I can have other men around me like that, I can share that burden. And this is a lot of young men, they want to know how to accomplish things in life, and you can't really accomplish very much completely alone. You need to be part of a group. You need to be in some sort of a hierarchy, because you are not learning anything when you're alone. You don't really learn. You learn as part of a group. At least, when it comes to having social accomplishments. You can learn stuff on your own. You can learn ideas and theories. But to actually become part of a society and to change society, you need to be integrated with society. And for a lot of young men, if you find young men who are not living up to their full potential, invariably they are not part of any kind of a hierarchy. They are fairly loose. They have friends, but those friends share no common goals. They're not trying to do anything together. They're not part of any group. They don't have any mission in life. And because of that, they're kind of floating aimlessly. And the moment that and the reason is they don't have sufficient agency to recognize that they need to have these things. And when they develop the agency, it's, you mentioned throughout your life, you're continuing to develop it. So I talk about the full agency. Full agency means you have enough agency to deal with the challenges you currently have in life. Most men, the moment they have enough agency for their current challenges, they're going to add one more challenge.
Yes.
And they're going to have to do more agency. And we're going to work our way up. And we'll work up to the level where it's not possible for us to add more agency for one reason or another. We're perhaps intellectually limited or energy-wise limited. So we're going to work our way up. The amount of energy you needed as a single man, the amount of agency, you needed as a single man is very different than what you needed as a married man or as a father. And if you
especially a father of a baby.
Exactly. And if you had another 4 kids, all of a sudden things would change. When you get enough kids, that starts to change because you need to organize your family very differently than when you have 1 or 2 kids compared to 4 or 5 or 6 kids. And so every step of life, it changes. When you're a grandfather, you know, your kids will one day grow up, they're going to move out, there'll be an in-between period, and you're going to need to have a different level of agency once again. And then you'll be a grandfather and you'll have all your grandkids, and you'll have to have a different level of agency again, because now you will be the patriarch of your family. You will have to pass on wisdom through your children to the next generation in a way where everyone is okay with this. You know, you have to help raise your grandchildren without stepping on your kids' toes and recognizing their authority as parents. So hopefully all throughout life, we're getting new challenges and we're developing higher levels of agency to deal with that. That's why this course isn't just good. The one that I wrote isn't just good for young men. I think it's vital for people who are parents or going to be parents, and vital as we mature and we keep hitting these new responsibilities.
Now, I think we should also speak to the fact that in this modern age of interconnectedness, you know, we're speaking from 2 different sides of the planet right now, and it's possible to develop a sense of being part of a hierarchy that is actually illusory. And you see this a lot in the gaming world where, you know, men who may not have very much agency at all in the workplace or in their social life, you know, belly to belly with people, they develop a persona and an avatar to go with it and a tribe. And they end up being, you know, in the virtual world, they may be the top dog of a great Raider team, but can that agency and those social skills that they develop there be applied in the physical world? And I think this is where a lot of young men get lost and they fall through the cracks and they fall into that incel trap, because they're not learning to turn the qualities that it does take on that social level online to develop agency and to become an alpha, to then apply that in the real world in a way that the women around them who are actually potential mates can see and sense and smell the pheromones of alphadom that women need to make a choice to go, okay, you're going to be my man. And online relationships and dating is fine. It's a great way to start. But eventually, when it comes to a relationship with a woman who you want to have children with, she needs to be in the room with you and look you in the eyes and smell you. And if that doesn't add up for her, if you don't demonstrate your agency to her in that physical real world, you've got no chance, and gene death awaits. So, you know, do you think that men who are sort of in that awkward stage in life that so many young men are facing, where they're living life online, they go and do whatever job they need to do, or maybe they're unemployed altogether, and they just have this, they invest heavily in the online life and the gaming life, can they transfer those skills and that agency that they develop interpersonally with people into the physical world to use it as a tool to develop their sexual market value?
Yeah, absolutely. All skills are usually transferable. The question is, you need to really understand why you've chosen to develop a essentially useless and valueless hierarchy as opposed to one that actually gets you something. I do think video games have a use for young people. You know, I remember playing video games about managing businesses and creating empires that you had to have economies and everything run. And then as an adult, certain aspects of my business really are close to that. Oh, I got to get this many resources to get this next upgrade, to do this next thing. And there was some practical application of it. But there is a limit to investing in it where now you're wasting your time. And if you really understand how to develop agency, how to develop your own future, how to, you know, get the most out of your own life, you're going to be able to transfer it. But if you don't understand how to develop agency, you might just be doing these things sort of as an instinct. You have an instinct to get into some social hierarchy. That's great. But you have this easy fake hierarchy. You know, building a house in Minecraft is fun, but you can't actually live there. You know, I will talk to, one of the things I ask most of my clients early on, especially the men, is I say, so are you in a social hierarchy? Oh yeah, I've got friends and blah, blah, blah. And I say, okay, so here's my real question. It's without rule of law. There's no police. And a gang of men have assaulted your front door and you can only hold them off for 15 minutes. Do you have people you'd call? Who would you call? If you don't have anybody that you would call, you don't have any real friends.
Mm.
If there's no one that you can call in a very short physical distance to you that's going to come and have your back and be willing to kill or die for you, you don't have real friends.
And there's a great flip side to this as well, because what that requires then is, at the very least, you need to invest in relationships with your immediate neighbors, you know, and any wise man would do this, because, you know, you go away on a holiday. It's nice to be able to just shout over the back fence and say, "Hey, Frank, can you watch the yard for me and send me a text if anything fishy's happening." Gives you peace of mind. It creates an opportunity for reciprocity. They can ask the same of you later. It's a small investment, but it's a good investment to make. And if you can go further and build those relationships with your immediate neighbors, even if you've got nothing in common with them other than the common boundaries you share, invite them over for a barbecue every couple of months. You know, do the basic due diligence to have a sense of who's around you. The flip side to this is that if you are a father and a husband, it gives your woman and your children great comfort to know that you know who lives around you, and you know which people to keep your eye on if there are some people in your neighborhood who aren't trustworthy. But if we get so trapped in this suburban modern lifestyle where we have our little box or our little plot that we live in, and we have no idea who's upstairs, even though we can hear them walking over us at night, and we have no idea who's downstairs, and, you know, that noisy neighbor over there, and, oh, I've seen that guy, but I don't know his name. It's a death trap. Because any of them could be a problem for you, or any of them could be the solution to your problem. But you don't know unless you invest.
Absolutely. And I think two things you mentioned very important is the investment. So you want to develop agency, got to make an investment. You want to be part of a hierarchy, you got to make an investment. First, you have to put out energy before you get something back. And I think for a lot of the incels, this is the problem. You'll notice that some of the most popular games are the ones that are free. You know, or you know, maybe you have to pay if you want to do certain things, but they're generally free. And you will find this deeply ingrained subculture amongst unsuccessful people of always looking for free things, freebies, free money, free stuff, free things, because they don't want to invest. They have very low trust that they will get something back from their investment. The low trust stems from the fact that they know they have low agency deep down inside, and they know that they're not very trustable about returning that investment. So high agency people are highly reciprocal in their relationships. They have a very strong sense of consciousness about returning the investment that has been given to them. And so when you're very conscientious, when you're a reciprocal person, you don't mind investing in relationships because you understand that you're going to get something back or not. If you don't, you'll know you'll end that relationship. But
that's the thing. You also then become less tolerant of people walking all over you. And that is a demonstration of agency that, again, women love to see. You know, like I will always extend the offer of, generosity to a new friend or a neighbor, to, put the feelers out there to make that opportunity come into being. And then you find pretty quickly when people can take but not give back, or when you then ask a favor of them after they've asked one of you, or you've offered something to them, once you realize there's an imbalance of reciprocity, I myself I don't have time for it. So I'm like, okay, I won't invest any further there. That person is, now in the outside. They're in the out group to me, at least a little bit. And I can also be very forgiving if they turn around and one day, or if they need my help, I'm still happy to be generous to a point. But the tolerance decreases as the reciprocity becomes less balanced. And what, as men, we need to, I think, be secure in ourselves, and what our women need to see is secure in us, is that we're not going to be a doormat to everyone who comes asking for a handout, that we are going to have boundaries and go, you know what? No, you're not there for me. You don't look out for me. So get lost, get off my lawn.
Exactly right. Most of those shit tests are about boundary pushing.
Yeah.
Children will do it too. My son will push boundaries. And if I don't push back, if I'm distracted with something at work or whatever, and I don't push back, he'll come to me upset and he'll say, "You were supposed to tell me I shouldn't do that thing." I'm like, "What thing?" I didn't notice because I was, maybe at work. And he'll say, "Oh yeah, I was doing X, Y, and Z." Or he came to me once and said, "My mom shouldn't let me have any more chocolate because chocolate isn't good for me. Why did she let me have chocolate?" She didn't know that I'd given him a piece, and she also gave him a piece. And she's like,
now you've obviously developed his agency enough and trained him enough in mindfulness that he could actually articulate exactly what the problem is.
Yeah,
now, a lot of kids,
he's 5
a lot of
years old,
kids,
and he recognizes this. Yesterday, I took him.
There are 18-year-olds who don't yet recognize it, but they have the emotional reaction to the lack of boundaries. They lash out in all kinds of ways, and especially when they get into being teenage boys, it can be really dangerous when they lash out. But they don't actually know why they're lashing out, and it is because children demand boundaries of us. It's great that your child can tell you exactly where you've let him down, because you've set yourself up for success as a parent that he can articulate it clearly.
Well, yesterday I took him to a boxing club. It's a little boxing club for small kids, and so he was learning, hitting a punching bag and stuff like this. And he started the class starving because he hadn't eaten when I told him to eat earlier. And, you can't stuff food down their throat. They have to eat. If they don't eat it, you warn them. If you don't eat, you will have these consequences. Usually, he will do, when I explain the consequences, he'll say, "That makes sense, and I will do what you said." Occasionally, he wants to test it and see what happens. So he didn't eat his food. He was starving, but I encouraged him to stick with it. He wanted to go home early. I encouraged him to stick with it the whole time. And I said, "You're hungry, but if you stick with it, and in fact, this is a wonderful training for our own agency, is fasting. And not just fasting, but while you're fasting, do something challenging. Work out, think, try to, do a big workout and then try to write something, or record yourself and talk coherently for 20 minutes afterwards while you're hungry. This forces you to have a tremendous amount of control over your mental reaction to your physical state.
Mm-hmm.
We can take people's agency away by not letting them sleep and not feeding them, and various things like this will make people break down psychologically. And by practicing this as children, you should be hungry as a kid every once in a while. People will say that's child abuse maybe, but it's good for you to pass times of being hungry. You
should be hungry as an adult once in a while.
Exactly. As an adult, take your kids camping. Don't bring enough food. And that sounds horrible, but honestly, you'll look back on it as an adult and go, "Those are some of the best times ever." Yeah, I was kind of hungry, but we all stuck together and went out and foraged some food or whatever. And so going through suffering while still achieving our goals is a huge part of agency. It's really easy to accomplish what you want to accomplish when there's no suffering involved. That's what these incels are doing, or just people in general are doing when they create virtual hierarchies and virtual worlds. They are attempting to achieve gains without any real risk, or any suffering. Those kind of gains do not build agency particularly. The reason is that it is important that we are at least willing to suffer to achieve our goal. We talked about this near the beginning of the conversation. The groups of people that are willing to follow through on their goal, even to the point of potentially dying, are the groups that will be successful. As individuals, it's the same. If we have goals and they're rational, consciously set goals that we've been careful to construct, we don't let anything get in the way of that. We don't let our own hunger, our own discomfort, our own, we're going to be tired from time to time. If we want to achieve something, we have to have habits. Those habits cannot be subject to our whims and to how we happen to feel at that moment. And the more that we do that, the easier it gets. My son develops more and more. So it's easy to see it in children because the development process is pretty quick. And it's easier to see it in someone else than in yourself. And I can see him as he's taking this sports classes that he's doing, that he's getting better and better at quickly following the instructions of the coach. And it's very different than when I'm giving him one-on-one instructions. because he's got to pay attention in a crowd, in a group of 30 kids. It's all chaos. Everyone's yelling. And he still has to focus and make himself do something. There are a lot of ways we can train our agency. And basically, if we missed out on agency training as children, and I think most people did, we have to take a lot of what we would have done with a kid to train in agency and do it with ourselves as adults. You know, every once in a while, I give my son a cold shower at the end. So he does his shower and I'll spray him with cold water. And I say to him, you're going to program yourself not to feel cold. It's how we're going to do it. You're going to shout, I am the king of cold. And you're going to shout that 100 times, loud as you can. And you're going to flex like this every time you do it. Okay, so there's that reinforcement to the idea. And then I'm going to spray you with cold water. And when he does that, I spray him with the cold water, and he is so happy that he was able to withstand the cold and not complain about it. It gives him a sense of deep satisfaction that he overcame a challenge. This is actually reprogramming how his brain views challenges. They are something to overcome, to get joy from accomplishing things. Rather than to be feared.
I took my son today to a roller skating rink. He's 7 years old, and he'd never been roller blading before. And you know, he was anxious, as we say. He really keen to give it a go, but you know, I could tell all the signs were there that he was anxious. And you know, first time you try it out, he's trying to walk with wheels on his feet. And so I haven't rollerbladed in 20 years myself, but it came back pretty quickly once I strapped them on. And so I got out there in the rink with him, and I just sort of helped him along the wall a little bit and gave him a couple of instructions. And I was like, don't try to walk. You've got to learn to let the wheels do the rolling for you and get a feel for it. But eventually I realized that the best thing I could do was actually just start zooming off. And I just started doing laps while he was just pulling himself around. And every now and then I'd check in, and if he'd fall down, I wouldn't help him, but let him get himself up, and I'd come back and, you're all right, you good, you need any help? No, I got it. And then gave him an hour, and by the end he's like, I've mastered this, because he could roll around the rink on his own without having to hold onto the wall. And I said, well, you've mastered balance on the rollerblades, and that's the first step. When you want to be a real master, look at that guy. And there's a 50-year-old guy there just zooming around gracefully like an absolute pro, like a professional figure skater. And so for children to experience that overcoming of the challenge, it doesn't happen if you mollycoddle them. It doesn't happen if you try to instruct and guide them along every single step of the way. Sometimes they just got to figure it out for themselves by falling on their ass a few times. And you can see there are plenty of parents who neglect their children, and their children get hurt, because they're not there to help them at all. And there are other parents who do the helicopter parenting thing. And I think this is a real source of low agency for a lot of the kids who are growing up today, is that the helicopter parenting phenomenon now, coming in this age of fear where it's like you can't even let your child climb up on the outside of the slide anymore, or climb on top of the castle at the playground anymore, because what if they fall and break their leg? And I think, lucky for my boy, my wife and I have always just had the attitude of, well, he'll climb as high as he's comfortable climbing, and if he breaks his leg, he'll learn that lesson once, and once is all he needs.
Yep.
So far, no breaks.
My great grandmother had 16 children, and there was no time for helicopter parenting when you have 16 kids. If you're not breastfeeding, you don't get attention, basically, from mom. You have to go to dad for stuff if you're not breastfeeding.
Or your siblings, I suppose.
And your siblings, because if you have 16 kids, the oldest siblings are completely grown before the other ones are even born. So there's quite a range. And you just don't have time for helicopter parenting. You have to be self-sufficient. They lived in a small cabin in the prairies in Canada, and they were, really settling the land. And that was not that long ago, and that was land that was still being settled. And the boys slept in the barn, and the girls slept in the extra bedroom, because the house only had 2 bedrooms. So if you were a boy, you had to look after yourself, man. You were 7 years old. You were almost a man. You
Mm.
had stuff to do, you had chores to do, you had things to accomplish. And we used to have pretty strict requirements for becoming a man. You go
Mm.
back in history, and I joke with my son about this, that when he's 15 or 14, we're going to go to Canada and he'll have to spear a bear, and that'll be his rite of passage to manhood.
And then eat the heart while it's still beating, right?
Yes, exactly. It's sort of
Yeah.
a joke, but if I can arrange it, I will. And there used to be these strict things, like you were a man, you knew you were a man. You knew you were a man because you had done the things of manhood. You had gone through the tests of manhood. And nowadays, I meet men in their early 20s and they don't know that they're men yet.
Mm.
They haven't truly internalized that they're men.
Mm.
Getting married and having kids, that helps. That'll internalize that you're a man. But if you haven't, you need to do that before you get married and have kids. You'll get a better quality of woman to begin with, and you'll be a better father. But what does it mean nowadays to be a man? It used to mean that you could watch the perimeter of your tribe with all the other men.
Mm.
You were considered responsible enough to carry a weapon, to fight, to kill, to hunt, to protect. Nowadays, men have been disarmed. We have no responsibility for protection. We phone the police. We phone other men. How emasculating,
Yeah.
There's danger. Quick, phone another man to help.
A man who's too far away to respond in any useful amount of time as well.
Yeah, they'll make some notes.
Oh, and I forgot to get to know the neighbors, so I can't call them either.
Yes.
Yeah,
Exactly.
and there's a we're aware, and young men who are a little bit red pilled at least are well aware that there is a systematic attack on masculinity in the West at the moment, in the culture, in the media, but I think too many young men are letting that be their excuse to go, well, how do I be a man if it's being attacked? It's always been up to men to decide what masculinity is. It's not the domain of women. It's not the domain of our government or of our filmmakers or any of these people. It's up to men to decide what it is to be a man and to police each other and to hold each other to high standards and to, kick each other's asses a bit to make sure that we're all stepping up. And, waiting around for the culture to change is an act of betadom or gammerdom, and it's, if you want to be a man of high agency, you need to start demanding of the men around you to be of high agency too and lift each other up. And I think that's where it will shift, is when men begin to have high expectations of each other.
You hit the nail on the head. It's the men around you.
Mm.
Our ancestors, they didn't care if the neighboring tribe thought their men were manly. You don't think we're manly? Come invade our tribe and see what happens. They were concerned with the approval of the in-group.
Yeah.
The only thing they wanted the out-group to do was fear them sufficiently not to attack.
Mm.
They didn't care if they liked them. They didn't care if they thought they were manly. They didn't care if they thought they were good even. They cared about what the in-group thought of them. It's up to men to define what masculinity is. It's up to us to define what masculinity is within our in-group. It's up to our in-group to define that. And we need to stop caring what other people think or other people say about us. And again, if you can be dissuaded from participating in your own in-group because there's an attack on masculinity or because women aren't what you thought they were, then you have such low agency, you probably will not breed and don't deserve to. You have to stop caring what the other groups think about you.
I would suspect that those particular males, won't necessarily call them men, those boys, if they were beginning to watch this video on agency at all, they would have checked out by now.
Yeah.
So it's the ones who are still here are here because they're interested in understanding their own current limitations and overcoming them. And so, it's safe to assume that those who are still watching this video are already taking steps towards improving their agency. And
you can check in the comments below, and you can identify the low agency men. They're going to make comments like, well, now you're shaming men. Or, I would show agency except, and then they'll have some excuses. Men of agency don't make excuses.
They take responsibility.
They take responsibility. You know, they take responsibility even for things which they cannot change. So, you know, if I've seen, you've probably seen videos of someone who's, you know, missing a leg and they're running a race. They're running a marathon. You don't see them going along going, hey, everybody slow down. I only got one leg here. Slow down. You know, they take responsibility for missing a leg, which probably isn't their fault. It's just something that happens, an accident or whatnot. They're taking responsibility for everything. And the more that we take personal responsibility, the less we say, oh, well, it's society's fault and it's this person's fault and it's this reason. And the more that we say, I will deal with it. I will do whatever I have to do and deal with whatever I have to deal with in order to have agency and to become a man. And the more that we're dedicated, like we mentioned a few times, dedicated to the point where I'd rather die than, you know, I'd rather live free than die. Nowadays it's, I'd rather live free or get $1,000, you know. It is not the attitude of men who change the world. The attitude of men who change the world is, I will do what I must do, whatever the consequences are. I'll do it no matter what. And those kind of men are dangerous to society. And society wants you to make excuses. The elites in power want you to be weak. The people that want to take your money, that want you to stop reproducing and take your lands and take your culture away from you, those people want you to give up. They want you to make excuses. They want you to have low agency. By God, they don't want you to learn how to have agency. They don't want you to suffer or struggle. They want you to be anesthetized until you die. And they want a peaceful resolution to you, but that means you're dead.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of effort put towards you could say a final solution for white people. And
it's happening.
It's happening. And the solution to it is there are specific things we're going to have to do. You can't do any of them if you're a low agency man. You know, Kurt Doodle says the men who won't fight don't matter. You know, and I say the men who don't have agency don't matter. Because if you don't have agency, you're not going to fight. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, that's it.
Exactly. Yeah. Same thing. And you can absolutely identify these low agency men. Because as soon as you propose a solution to their problems, they come up with 50 excuses why they can't make that solution a reality.
Now, a lot of guys will be challenged with the question of, yeah, sure, I can identify other low agency men, but how do I know if I'm one of them or not? And the only way to know is incrementally increase your challenge in life. Every day, push yourself harder physically, you know, push your physical health physically, you know, a little bit more each day. Push your mental abilities every day, you know, challenge yourself with new knowledge, you know, poke the edges of your emotional life, figure out where your soft spots are from your childhood, from the neglect you faced from your parents or from, you know, the early relationships that damaged you. Find out about those gray areas and poke at them a bit until you toughen up and until you learn to deal with the emotions that come up so that no one else can poke at them and take your agency away from you. So that deliberate, systematic process of hardening and strengthening yourself little bit by little bit is all it takes to find out where the limits of your agency are. But if you never start looking, you'll never find out. And by definition, you are of low agency if you're not looking for the edge.
Yeah. And that is one of the best ways you can do it. That's how you will progress towards agency. And one of the other ways to quickly identify your level of agency, make a list of the 5 people you spend the most time with. I say people. If you're a man, that list should be all men, except for your wife, of course. But it should be all men. You shouldn't be spending a ton of time with women because their ways of showing agency are very different than ours, since they have a different role in society, or at least they should. And because of that, it's not going to help us display agency. But make that list. Are those all men of agency? If your 5 best friends, first of all, if you don't have any, if you can't put anyone in that list, or you only have 1 or 2, you're not displaying sufficient agency, because a man of agency recognizes he needs to surround himself with other men of agency. Also, if those men are not men of agency, that reflects poorly on you, because either you're not a man of agency and therefore helping them to develop their agency, and therefore you have a bunch of low agency friends, or you have high agency friends and they haven't told you that you need to work on your agency. Maybe you're all high agency. You haven't had to tell each other that. So you can tell a lot by the friend group that you have, by your social group. A lack of a social group tells you one thing, and a low agency social group tells you another. And it is a really, really important way to understand where we're fitting in society. It is a lot of work nowadays to make friends. We work a lot of hours. We are socially isolated. We often live far away, and society is more fractured along ideological lines than ever before. And so it's a lot of work. I mean, if you have 5 friends, you've done a lot of work investing into social things nowadays. If you're a kid and you got 5 friends, that's because you went to school and there's like a million other children there. But as an adult, to have 5 friends, that's not easy, And that should be a goal for every man of agency, is to have some friends around that they're going to sharpen. The Bible says, as iron sharpens an iron, so one man sharpens the face of another. And the reality is that it's practically impossible to develop agency in a vacuum. We need other men, preferably of higher agency, around us to point out to us things where we might be blind and to help us start thinking about them. Very often they're just, lighting the match that starts that flame inside of us. And in turn, then we help the next group of young men that are coming in to learn agency. It's like a chain. Those men with more agency help those with less, who help those with almost none. And we should be pulling each other up as a society.
Now we're seeing in Australia at the moment, there have been a number of groups, and some of them are international groups as well, that are specifically created for this purpose. Male fraternities, clubs, societies. There's the Proud Boys in Victoria here. There was the Lad Society, and all of these groups, as they become, because they're, I guess, Proud Boys calls themselves a drinking group with a political problem. But because there's a political element to them and they gain some notoriety, they immediately come under attack and they're disbanded. But, these groups can be informal. They can just be social groups. But, we're beginning to see as men in the West that the reason we're in the strife that we're in at the moment is because the agency of Western men has been diminished severely over the last 70 years. Pretty much since World War II, it's been on a downward spiral. And so these groups are naturally emerging because men realize they need to not only sharpen themselves by, being with other men of higher agency, but that we have a responsibility to our society to be mentors to the younger men around us and to be role models to them. And, I think I've been saying on my show for quite a while that there's a masculine renaissance coming, and it's unstoppable because it's absolutely necessary to the survival of our people. And so, get on that train. Like, it's just time to, you may not be, anywhere near the top of the ladder. It doesn't matter. Just get on the train and start progressing, start climbing that ladder of agency and start figuring out where you are on the hierarchy by getting into some conflict with other men in a healthy, competitive way. Everyone can do it. Every man can do it. And, I think the more that we can encourage those who are, the weakest among us, those boys who've been broken by neglect, who have been, shunted away into the virtual world, who've not been taught reciprocity, who've not been taught agency, not been given any advantages genetically or with their looks or anything in the sexual market, once they get into those groups with other men, if we're looking out for each other and helping each other to, rise, then we get this sort of trickle-down effect where the men of highest agency have enough to distribute to others, by mentorship and teaching and leadership and example. And it's going to be glorious as it sweeps through the West. And, our enemies are going to be terrified by it. I'm looking forward to that.
It's going to make a huge difference. A man of agency is a dangerous man. A man of agency is dangerous to those who would take his agency from him and those who would abuse him. And he is a friend to those who are on his side. He's
exactly
the greatest ally you can have as a man of agency. There's probably, for you can probably think about some men in your life who've made a big impact on you, who just being around them has improved your life. And when you think about it, those were men of agency. No man made a positive impact on your life because he was a man without agency.
Yeah.
The men without agency, if you're a young man and you don't have a lot of agency, this is something you have to develop. It's not something that will just come. The fact you don't have it yet doesn't mean you can't have it. It just means you haven't yet developed it. And if you go and develop agency, you're going to look back on your life 5 or 10 years before you started doing it, and you're going to really notice a huge difference. Everything changes when you develop agency. A lot of people think that they've been unsuccessful because of the environment they're in. Very often, it's nothing to do with the environment, or they're in an environment without success because they're not people of agency who can get into the right environment. I have men tell me all the time, and yes, women also, by the way, need to work on their agency. I'm going to do some interviews with women about that. But men will complain to me that the quality of women nowadays is not as high as they would like. And I will explain to them that the high quality women that are out there are intentionally avoiding these men because those men do not have sufficient agency. And
I would argue as well that the general standard of quality of women has decreased, no doubt about it, but only because of the lack of male agency holding them to higher standards.
What would happen 150 years ago if someone came to your community and was seducing all of the women? He would disappear very quickly. Men policed the sexual market in the past, and they were so dedicated to policing the sexual market that there were lethal outcomes to flaunting social norms. If you tried to corrupt someone's children 150, 200 years ago, you would probably get stoned by the local populace. We used to have, our ancestors had enormous balls. They would go, tax collector was a dangerous profession. You tended to disappear. There were all kinds of things. When you came along to take someone's agency, they were not too happy about it. They would take whatever steps were necessary to protect their families and to protect themselves and their own agency in their communities. Men today will do a lot of complaining, but very few men are sufficiently dedicated to take the kind of action our ancestors would have taken, the effective action our ancestors would have taken. We can see some examples of groups who are willing to take action. In the UK, there are Muslim groups have convinced the local school to stop the LGBT education policies because they stood together as a group. They went in there and they physically intimidated the school into stop doing it. People say, oh, it happened without violence. No, it didn't. They went in there and physically intimidated them. If you see the videos, they were yelling and screaming and standing on tables. And I'm sure there was a little, don't forget, we'll come visit you with a truck of peace if you keep doing this. They were serious about it. They went and took their responsibility to protect their children seriously.
That's right. And the rational fear of the potential outbreak of violence is enough, for people to say, I yield to your higher agency.
Exactly. Police don't have to shoot people to keep the peace. They often just have to be present.
Yeah.
When police are present, there will be less violence.
And so it's an issue of will, isn't it? You said before that competency is only ever really tested when you've got two people or two groups of equal will. But it's the will that makes all the difference. Intelligence, sophistication of warfare, all of that matters much less than the will and the intensity of that will and how it's applied. And to go back to sort of how we were defining agency at the beginning, I see agency as being, it's sort of the thing that separates humans from animals, in that it's where we can use our ego and our volition to change things in the world. And this is how we have adapted and evolved as a people, as a species, as a people, as cultures. And it's how we've ended up with these sort of clashing civilizations where it's will against will, the will of one people versus the will of another, and they come together and they clash, and one will win over the others and gain some territory. And it all comes down to that ability to assert your will and to do it in lockstep with other people around you who share your values and share your agency. And suddenly this pervasive LGBT agenda that seems to be impossible to stop goes away, because a group with higher will applies their agency.
Tony Robinson talked about this. He said that there has been certain Islamic groups going to various small towns in the UK and saying, well, you don't have any Muslims living here yet, but we want you to build a mosque so that we can start moving them in. And the town will go, well, we don't have any Muslims, how can we justify building a mosque? And they'll say, well, this is how you can justify it. The mosque will cost £2 million, and the amount of damage we can cause by rioting in your town for a weekend is about £10 million. And so it's a lot. You're going to save £8 million for your taxpayers by building the mosque. And they've done this to hundreds of small towns in the UK. And they said,
wow,
roughly around last summer, the native British people started realizing what was happening. Because the government ones can't admit they have these meetings. It's very difficult for them to admit this because of corruption. And even though they're giving in to threats, if they admit it, it just becomes a more bigger problem. Some of the native British groups have figured this out. And they're going around to some of the small towns following up on the original threat and going, if you build a mosque, we're still going to come and do £10 million of damage. So, yeah.
Do the math.
Yeah. We're one way or the other. And so they're threatening to negate the violent potential of the other team. And we have to really understand that society is divided up into teams. There are times when teams cooperate, but there are a lot of times when they compete. And we as individuals, you mentioned willpower. Willpower is extremely important. It's a big part of agency. It's your ability to implement your will. We need to be able to do that first in our own lives. If we can implement our will in our own lives, we will immediately start hooking up with people that also can do that. We float to the level we're at. If we're surrounded by people that, I will hear this from time to time that, oh, the West is done because, I look around and everyone is so weak in the West. I don't look at that. When I look around at the people I know, I see strong people. I see men like you, I see men like Kurt Doolittle. I see even men who are more into the philosophical way of solving problems like Stephen Molyneux and others. I see strong men wherever I look. That's because at the level that I'm at, that's the only kind of men that are around me. Other men become.
But if you look in the comments below.
But you can look in the comments below for the other kind. And what happens is if you have a very negative view of Western society, it's because you're embodying the negative things that you're concerned about. Now, of course, you can be realistic and say, as you mentioned before, for example, the quality of women in the West has dropped. And recognizing these things is fine. But when you believe we have no hope, it's because you don't realize your own potential. When your agency is sufficiently high, you will become surrounded by more men of agency. The fact is that the West, we've always been outnumbered. During the European reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula, Dom Alfonso Henriques, the Portuguese king, had roughly 300 professional soldiers. And he turned back about 30,000 Islamic fighters with 300 guys, outnumbered 100 to 1. But these guys this was a do or die mission. You know, these guys had nothing else to live for but their mission.
Deus fault.
Yeah, we're going to do it or we're going to die trying.
Yeah.
And they were so successful at this that they started to get other countries. The British came and supported them at a certain point, and other armies as well, because they said, man, these guys, they're really getting something done over there. You know, they were able to convince large numbers of people from rest of Europe to move into the northern Portuguese towns. A lot of them had been completely depopulated, and they were repopulated. And it was really very few men who changed the entire course of a huge chunk of Europe. In Spain, there was a few more, but they were also facing much more enemies. But the ratio wasn't that far off from what it was in Portugal.
And really, when people begin to see and hear of these tales of men of extremely high agency being effective, it awakens the spirit of other men. You know, that kind of courage and those kinds of men of action, it has a contagious effect because it sets the standard for the whole marketplace of human action. You know, it sets the bar higher. And then for starters, every woman starts going, wow, do you hear about that 300? You know, and all the other men go, well, those 300 men that we're hearing about in a far distant land have just completely shifted the sexual market in our country. We better up our game. And it, you know, for so many reasons, you know, biological, certainly psychological and spiritually, it awakens the spirit of men around the world when we hear of that kind of courage. So let's bring it on.
Yeah, we need the courage to take action first in our own life, then in the world around us. Don't get too caught up in self-improvement because a big part of how you're going to improve yourself is by imposing your will on the world around you. And that is, you know, it's like exercising for the sake of exercising is not particularly effective. If you exercise for a purpose, you know, you're going to compete in something. You're going to, you're having a competition even with friends. You know, who can lift more, increase their lift by the most in the next 6 months or the next 3 months or whatever. When you do that,
you know, like clean up your room, fine. But after you've cleaned up your room, learn how to cut down a tree and turn it into a fence.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You know, learn how to do things. And most important is get out of your room. You know, get out of your room, get out into public, get out talking to people, get out there.
Get out into nature as well. Nature, you know, really can develop the will. You know, when you're out there facing the elements, camping trips and doing things like, you know, cutting down trees and, you know, learning how to use a chainsaw, these kinds of activities, swing an axe, you know, man's will against nature and the elements is a great way to develop agency.
And that's a big part of the reason why early settlers had so much agency is because it really was them imposing their will on an unforgiving environment. It was, you know, I'm going to chop this tree down or I'm going to die of cold in the wintertime because I'm not going to be able to build a house or heat the house. And so
Mother Nature doesn't care if you're the alpha or not. She's going to try to kill you all equally.
Yeah, she's going to try to kill you all. And even, you know, the thing is that, and I will hear this excuse too, oh, so-and-so is so alpha, but look, their life turned out bad. You know, some of the alphas died too. Being willing to accomplish your mission, whether you live or die, indicates that at some point, some of you will die.
Yeah.
You know, being willing to follow through on what you believe in life with a passion that can't be taken away from you. You can't get completely discouraged. You can't give up because you have such a passion for what you're doing. That will occasionally lead you into suffering and problems. You will suffer from doing the right thing. And if that makes you stop, then you don't have sufficient agency. You need to work on your agency. And because the suffering is just, it's going to happen. You know, our ancestors, they expected suffering. I was reading some stories of Portuguese sailors hopping on these tiny little boats, sailing around the Horn of Africa and off to India to try to create trade routes. And, you know, starting out, they knew that half of them wouldn't make it back. They knew that. was quite clear.
Mm.
They were told half of you won't make it back. That's roughly the amount that will die of scurvy and other diseases. This was before the British had figured out that vitamin C was important. So even a short voyage, you get about 6 weeks out, you've got no vitamin C, you start decaying pretty quick. Yeah. So we can die. Okay, let's get on the boat and go.
You just make a decision. Well, I'm going to be in the top half of that group.
I'm a poor man. I can either scrape by until I'm old and then die of old age, or I can go and risk my life on a little tiny boat going to India and maybe come back incredibly wealthy and marry a beautiful woman and have a bunch of kids.
Nothing ventured, nothing gained.
Exactly. If you're not getting what you want in life, you need to start taking bigger risks. You need to start being willing to lose more. That might mean losing some of the bad habits you have. The suffering might be in that maybe you really enjoy doing some things that are harmful to you. Maybe you really like smoking weed. This is a big problem. Maybe you really like it and it gives you a lot of pleasure and joy, but it's getting in the way of you having the motivation to do the things you need to do. Maybe sacrificing weed, going cold turkey, just no more of it, might be the sacrifice you need to open that space in your life to accomplish the things you want to get done. There are people that are high performance drug addicts, but and people will look at that and go, well, he could do all of that while he was on weed. And it's like, yeah, well, and then there's a whole load of other people that did nothing because they were taking drugs. And
imagine what he could do if he wasn't on weed.
Exactly.
We'll never know.
Exactly. And there are people who are depressed who have tried to kill themselves, and the act of trying to kill themselves helped actually heal them emotionally, because they decided partway through that, oh man, I don't want to die.
Yeah.
And that was the epiphany they needed to start fixing their lives. There are other people who ended up dead. These are not solutions to your problems because they are not replicatable. You cannot be reasonably sure that they're going to work. We know how to teach people agency. We know how to teach people to control their lives and have success. Successful people like you and I know how to create other successful people.
And I guess if you're taking that incremental approach to developing your agency as a young man or as any age man, and understanding that, you must take risks, you must be willing to make sacrifices, and you must be willing to risk failure, that sometimes you will fail. And the bigger the risk, the more the failure is going to hurt. But, there's only a handful of failures that will actually kill you. Many of the failures that you need to face to develop your agency won't kill you, but they'll hurt a lot. You might have to start from scratch. You might lose all your money. You might actually injure yourself and have to then, rehabilitate yourself. But
you might have massive social embarrassment. That's what most people are afraid of, is social embarrassment.
It's a killer for a lot of people.
Never get married and never have children because they're afraid of female rejection.
Wow, self-fulfilling prophecy right there, isn't it?
They literally choose genetic death rather than potential humiliation.
Yeah. And, as married men, we can both say marriage sometimes hurts. Marriage sometimes is embarrassing. Sometimes it's humiliating, especially when you screw up as a husband, and you know it. And your wife is right there calling you out because that's her job. She's there to develop your agency too. And you have to experience that failure and embarrassment and shame and be hurt by it to toughen up. And so it's this incremental challenge of finding the edges of your agency and then poking yourself there, letting the people you love and trust poke you there until you've experienced enough pain that you're now stronger and have higher agency, so the edge has moved, and then find the edge again and keep going.
Yeah, and you'll hit a place where further progress is almost impossible, but almost very few people ever hit that place because they're not pushing that envelope. We all have some sort of natural limitations. Most people never hit their natural limitations. This is why you will see people have even below average IQ who are quite successful in life because they have worked on developing their agency. They've squeezed every drop of potential out of their lives. And so they're able to be fairly successful. And you will see
Yeah.
people with very high, there was some controversy recently because the connection between economic success and IQ was not, in the higher ends, was not as clear as it's not a perfect line. It's not a perfect one-to-one ratio. You know, why do smart people sometimes become very unsuccessful? You know, in fact, there's lots of smart people with a low level of success. For one reason or another, they have chosen to not develop their agency, and therefore they are not able to take advantage of their potential. And this will throw off. And apparently there's a lot of these people because it's enough to be a statistic, to affect the statistics about success compared to IQ. And we know in general IQ is very important. This can happen to an entire civilization. Western civilization is not living up to its potential. You know, in the 1950s, they promised us flying cars and we'd be living on the moon by now. And they didn't promise us that as a, you know, complete imagination. This came from them plotting out where technology was developing, where society was developing. And they said, you know, if we keep this up for another 50 to 70 years, we're going to be on the moon, living on the moon. Well, we're not only not living on the moon, you know, in most first world countries, we've got loads of massive amounts of homeless people. We have rising crime rates in some places, depending on where we are. We have
nihilism, drug addiction, suicide, all kinds of sicknesses.
Yeah, we have the rampant acceptance of mental instability as a way of life. We have all kinds of serious problems in the West where we're going back to dealing with problems that our ancestors had solved.
Mm.
We're even talking about how in some countries, you know, for example, Venezuela was quite advanced in the past. It wasn't really part of the West exactly, but it was quite advanced. And now they're going back to, they don't even have electricity and running water. They're truly devolving into the third world again. And
this could be us.
Yeah, this could be us. You get enough low agency people, there is no limit to how degenerated Western society can be if enough people fail to show agency.
Mm.
And, you know, there will come a point where those men of agency, like you, like me, and like others, will band together. We will pick our place. We will put up a wall, and we will say, keep the hordes out. This is civilization. That's not.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we're going to have to separate speciate and grow by having lots of children again.
Mm.
And if you want to be on our side of the fence, you have to develop agency. You know, men of agency are in high demand. Right now, talk to anyone that employs people. They will complain about various problems in trying to find a new employee. They're all complaining about problems of agency.
Mm.
You cannot find high agency people are all employed. So you can't find any of them when you want to employ one.
Yeah. Look, every problem out there in the world is only solved by agency. And the more agency we have on the market, the faster we solve problems, the faster we grow as a species, and the faster we do get the flying cars and living on the moon and, you know, create a strong and, you know, 1,000-year utopia. It's possible if we develop our agency enough. So there's no cap on how much agency is in demand. You know, how far do you want civilization to grow? That's the question. And it's, you know, agency is a, you know, it's an inexhaustible demand, or it's an insatiable demand in the world. And then we decide how much we supply into the market by our choices.
Yes, and as we hit peak lack of agency, and I think we're hitting that now. I think it's going to start turning around. And honestly, I made this course because I started as a coach because I do not want my son growing up in a world surrounded by people of low agency. And I started the SMV4K to help people to find each other and get married and have kids so that the people of agency are having children, so that people that are good people with lots of potential are able to act on that potential. And I wanted to create a better future for my children. And I think that improving the amount of agency in the West is the key to doing that. There are lots of things we're going to have to do. And arguing about what we have to do is not productive when you have so many people of low agency. In the past, in certain parts of the world where life was fairly easy, you had a huge dichotomy. You had this small group with agency at the top and then loads of peasants. Surprisingly, Europe wasn't quite like that. Even during manoralism, average peasants had a lot of control over what they did. They weren't slaves. They had a lot of control over what they did. And this bred into us a higher level of agency as a people. But in lots of parts of the world, it wasn't necessary to have so much agency. And you'll see these parts of the world, even now, if they're relatively economically successful, they're not very innovative. Innovation comes from agency. You see a problem, you solve it. You don't wait for someone else to solve it. Then you get innovation. Or you don't just assume it's unsolvable, and therefore you get innovation. In the West, we've had this innovation because we've had traditionally more men of agency than we had in any other part of the world. As we progress, new technological developments, new economic developments are getting harder to come by. Therefore, the value of having high agency people is increasing. And those who do have agency will become in higher and higher demand until it starts, anytime there's high demand, it starts to pull people into that demand. It will start pulling people or incentivizing people to develop their agency. And I think we're going to return to a high agency society. You cannot have a highly technologically advanced society of slaves. There are some cultures where people have a slave-like mentality, and it's perfectly acceptable in their cultures, but they can't become high technology cultures without borrowing that technology from us. And so for us to continue to advance society, we need to have that agency and increase it.
Well, I think we're being part of the solution right here, and I'm really looking forward to doing your course as well, because as I said, my agency's come a long way, and it feels to me as though it's exponentially accelerating. I've gone from a few years ago really struggling with low impulse control in a lot of ways, and it's shifting very quickly, and it builds upon itself. But I need to chase the edge again, I need to find those other areas. So I think doing this course is going to be great for me, as I'm sure it'll be for people at any stage of their development.
That's excellent. Well, thank you very much for coming on and talking to me today about agency, and especially about how it can help young men in society. And where can people, if they want to see more from you, James, where can they go?
Best place to go is on YouTube. The Rational Rise is the name of my channel. We talk about, men's issues quite a lot. We talk about philosophy, psychology. We report on the propaganda that's coming our way from the mainstream media. And I have conversations with, interesting people from all walks of life. So yeah, check out The Rational Rise on YouTube.
Yeah, I absolutely recommend people go and see you, watch your videos. They're interesting. They're timely. There's some good humor in there as well. And I think it's very entertaining, and we have a lack of media that is rational and that is, you could say, on our side, that wants the best for what we are as a people. And so when we find it, we need to support it. Thank you very much, James, and have a great weekend.
You too, Noah. Thanks. My pleasure.